Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's keep week 56 going with today's Tolkien Tuesday. Now, we're still deep into Humphrey Carpenter's book, The Inklings, examining the similarities and differences between the men who made up the Inklings. Today, I'm still in the chapter A Fox That Isn't There. This time, I'm going to be talking through Carpenter's examination of male friendships in the Oxford University setting, specifically in this episode, C.S. Lewis's thoughts on them. Now, let's start with a little history that Carpenter alludes to but doesn't explain. Oxford and Cambridge University colleges were originally founded for unmarried men. Students were required to take vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, with the majority of them training for the priesthood. Now, this connection between the monastic life and academia isn't something we think about today. But here's the shocker. It wasn't until 1882 that celibacy was no longer required. Now, that sounds like it's a long time ago for us, but that had only been 30 years before Tolkien attended Exeter College, Oxford. So the equivalent change would be for us something that happened in the mid-90s, so it's a relatively recent change culturally. Small wonder, then, that Carpenter begins by pointing out that even by the time Lewis was at Oxford, it was still customary for dons, even married dons, to spend a large part of their spare time in each other's company. And Lewis had strong views on the subject of male friendship, dating back to early in his life. Carpenter writes that he believed that full intimacy with another man could only be achieved if women were completely excluded. He quotes an entry from Lewis's 1922 diary as reading, "A friend dead is to be mourned. A friend married is to be guarded against, both being equally lost." And in a letter to Owen Barfield during their Great War debate, he acknowledged that he could only speak of my own affairs with some difficulty, and don't think it conduces to the right sort of intimacy, male intimacy, to do so very often. Now, Carpenter argues that these were not just chance remarks. Each of them reflects very closely the sort of person he was. First of all, his statement that a friend married is to be guarded against was part of his whole attitude to women, for he was firmly convinced from an early age that the female psychology was entirely different from and largely inimical, that means harmful or unfriendly, to that of the male. In 1923, he and Barfield discussed the subject and agreed that either men or women are mad. Not that they themselves had any doubt as to which sex was sane. Those are Carpenter's words, by the way, not mine. Just want to make that really clear. Now, Lewis held views on this that, if I'm honest, I find quite troubling, but we need to look at them, so here we go. In a 1940 letter to a former student, Mary Nayland, I believe is how it's pronounced, he makes the argument that there has to be a head in marriage in order for it to survive as a permanent relationship. He writes, one party or other must have the casting vote. He then writes, that being so, do you really want the head to be the woman? In a particular instance, no doubt you may, but do you really want a matriarchal world? Do you really like women in authority? When you seek authority yourself, do you naturally seek it in a woman? And as Carpenter points out, one might note that in Lewis's Perelandra, the Eve and Adam are referred to respectively as the lady and the king. Still, Carpenter argues that Lewis was not a misogynist. Nevertheless, he writes that Lewis did regard the female mind as inferior to the male, or at least as being incapable of the mental activities which he valued. He told Charles Williams that he thought women's minds not really meant for logic or great art. And going back to Lewis's own writings, he shows that the traits that Lewis wanted to find in women was expressed in The Lady from Perelandra and Mrs. Dimble in That Hideous Strength. As Carpenter writes, intelligence certainly, but submissiveness to the male and great motherliness. Not merely motherliness, moreover, but fertility. One of Jane Studdock's sins in That Hideous Strength is her refusal to bear children. Troubling, to be sure. Carpenter nevertheless excuses these attitudes to an extent, arguing correctly that these attitudes were typical of his social background and of Oxford in particular. And that's when he points to the reforms of the late 19th century that allowed college fellows to marry, but how those marriages were still not really part of university life. Carpenter writes, dons worked in their colleges and took a large proportion of their meals there. Their college was almost invariably the center of their social life. In the meantime, their wives were obliged to remain at home in the suburbs, superintending the servants and bringing up the children. And since many of the wives were, as a result of these patriarchal policies, less educated, the conversations that they did get to join didn't satisfy Lewis, who wrote, "The men have learned to live among ideas. They know what discussion, proof, and illustration mean. A woman who has had merely school lessons and has abandoned soon after marriage whatever tinge of culture they gave her, whose reading is the women's magazines, and whose general conversation is almost wholly narrative, cannot really enter such a circle." End quote. Well, not surprisingly, women didn't exactly find Lewis a joy to be around. Carpenter writes, "Many women found Lewis as unbearable as he found them. If they had no real conversation, he had no small talk whatever, and they often felt that he was blundering, brusque, or downright rude." Still, despite all this, Carpenter writes, "Lewis did not enter into male friendship in a manner that could be described as hearty or boorish. He was capable also of great delicacy and sensitivity, perhaps even feminine sensitivity. In a 1952 letter, Lewis wrote, 'There ought spiritually to be a man in every woman and a woman in every man. And how horrid the ones who haven't got it are. I can't bear a man's man or a woman's woman.'" Now that, unlike many of the other things he said, is a thought I can get behind. Carpenter writes a lot more on Lewis and friendship, but I want to move to the end of that section so that we can get on to Tolkien and Williams next week to end the series. Carpenter talks about the exaggeration of Lewis's essay, The Four Loves, but says that there is a lot in that relates to his life, and these are really interesting. First, Carpenter points out that Lewis's argument that real friendship begins when two acquaintances discover that they have some common insight or taste inevitably recalls his and Tolkien's discovery of their mutual delight in northernness, which we talked about here near the beginning of our time in the Inklings back in April. A second, Carpenter argues that Lewis's own position that friendship isn't about agreeing on answers, but is about agreeing what are the important questions, is reminiscent of how he and Barfield maintained close ties, even after deep disagreements about core religious beliefs. Third, he points out that Lewis argued that friendship isn't inquisitive. You become a man's friend without knowing or caring whether he is married or single or how he earns his living, and says that this is a statement of his own obstinate refusal to admit private matters into conversation with his friends. And finally, Lewis claimed that real friendship isn't jealous, writing, "In each of my friends there is something that only some other friend can fully bring out." Carpenter concludes that that comes closest of all to explaining what the Inklings were fundamentally about. For now, folks, this wraps up this week's Tolkien Tuesday. Be sure to join me again next week as we conclude this series with more on male friendship in Oxford with views from Tolkien and Charles Williams. In the meantime, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can join the Content Council and be a part of deciding what I talk about here. You also can support the show, get an ad-free feed, and a bonus episode every week. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Word Nerd Wednesday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.